I never thought I would see my grandfather staring down the barrels of fake police pistols in the middle of his driveway, but that was exactly the scene that played out one quiet afternoon when HOA Karen showed up with her newest stunt. One moment we were sipping sweet tea on his porch, the next moment two men in uniforms that didn't match any department in the county strutted onto his land, demanding that he sign papers or be arrested. And just as they thought they had him cornered, Grandpa stood up, brushed off his old denim shirt, and calmly pulled open the drawer by his chair, lifting out his Colt with the kind of slow, deliberate motion that froze everyone on the spot. The funny part was he didn't even point it at them. He just set it across his lap like it was nothing more than a pocketknife. That was the moment Karen's smug grin cracked, and that's when the story really began. My grandfather was the type of man who never asked anyone for anything. His land had been in our family for generations, stretching out over rolling fields where the grass bent like waves in the wind, and he liked to remind people that no homeowners association had ever planted a fence post there, and no HOA ever would. He lived simply, repairing his barn with his own hands, keeping chickens that wandered too far into the road, and sitting on the porch every evening to watch the sun go down. To him, independence wasn't just a choice, it was a birthright. And yet, that independence made him the perfect target for Karen, the self-appointed queen of the nearby HOA, who hated nothing more than people she couldn't control. She had tried letters, fines, and even town meetings where she spread rumors about Grandpa's so-called violations, but when none of that worked, she decided to up the ante. The first sign something was wrong that day was the silence of the neighborhood. Usually, even on the edges of Grandpa's land, you could hear kids laughing, dogs barking, or tractors humming in the distance. Instead, there was only the crunch of gravel under tires as a black SUV rolled slowly toward his gate. Karen climbed out like she was stepping onto a stage, wearing oversized sunglasses and a smile so wide it looked painted on. Behind her, the two uniformed men emerged, puffing their chests as though they were about to arrest a gang of outlaws. Grandpa didn't even flinch. He just rocked back in his chair, letting the creak of wood echo in the stillness, and muttered to me without looking away, "Those ain't real cops, boy." Karen marched up the driveway holding a stack of papers, announcing that Grandpa's property had been absorbed into the HOA district and that he was required to sign the agreement immediately or face removal. The fake officers stepped forward, placing their hands on cheap plastic holsters that looked like they'd been ordered online. My gut tightened because even if they weren't real, the situation was too strange, too dangerous. But Grandpa's eyes sparkled with the kind of amusement I only saw when someone was walking themselves straight into one of his traps. He stood, walked over to the small table by his chair, and slid open the drawer. That's when the Colt appeared, polished but well-worn, the same revolver that had hung on his wall for as long as I could remember. He set it on his lap, his thumb brushing the handle like he was greeting an old friend, and looked directly at Karen. "Funny thing," he said in a voice low and steady, "the last time I saw a badge like that was in a costume shop down on Main Street." The men stiffened, their bravado draining from their faces, and Karen tried to laugh, though the sound came out too high-pitched to be convincing. She insisted they were real officers authorized by the HOA's security committee, which only made Grandpa laugh so hard he nearly spilled his tea. "Ain't no such thing as an HOA sheriff," he said, his tone halfway between mocking and deadly serious. The Colt wasn't pointed at anyone, but its presence was louder than any words could be. I could feel the tension rising, my own heart pounding as I glanced between the fake police, Karen's trembling hands clutching her stack of papers, and Grandpa sitting calm as a stone. There was something both terrifying and hilarious about the whole picture, as if the world had flipped into a theater play where the actors didn't know their lines. The fake cops looked at each other, waiting for Karen's cue, but Karen had lost all control. Her attempt at intimidation had backfired the second Grandpa revealed. He wasn't a man to be pushed. The silence stretched, broken only by the chirp of a bird overhead and the sound of Karen shuffling her papers nervously. Grandpa leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he asked them a question so simple it cut deeper than any threat. "Who signed your paycheck?" The men blinked, their mouths opening but no words coming out. Karen tried to cover, saying it was all official business, but the cracks in her plan were widening. And with each second she faltered, Grandpa grew steadier, like a poker player who knew the other side's hand before they even laid it down. I thought back to all the times he had told me stories about standing firm when people tried to take what wasn't theirs. He believed in fairness, but he also believed in defending what was right. And here it was again, playing out in real time, only now it wasn't some far-off tale but a real battle on his land. He didn't need to raise his voice, he didn't need to point his weapon, because he had something they didn't, a truth that couldn't be bent by paper or fake uniforms. Karen's face flushed red, her jaw tightening as she tried to regain her composure. She announced in a shrill tone that Grandpa would regret this, that the HOA had ways of enforcing compliance. But Grandpa just leaned back, his Colt glinting in the sunlight, and said calmly, "I reckon the only thing I'll regret is if I waste another second listening to nonsense." The fake cops hesitated, their swagger gone, and I realized the power balance had flipped completely. The people who came to intimidate were now the ones looking for a way out. The moment might have ended there if not for the unexpected twist that followed. Karen, desperate not to lose face, pulled out her phone and started dialing, threatening to call more backup. Grandpa smirked, raising his eyebrow as though daring her to go through with it. That's when he quietly nodded toward the old security camera mounted on his porch, its little red light blinking. I hadn't even noticed it until that moment, but it had been recording the entire encounter. Karen froze, her voice dying in her throat as the realization hit her. Every second of her stunt had been captured, every lie documented. That was the day I realized my grandfather wasn't just an old man with stubborn pride. He was a man who knew how to stand against bullies, whether they wore a cheap uniform or carried a stack of bogus papers. And as Karen retreated to her SUV, her heels clicking nervously on the gravel, I knew this wasn't over. She'd be back, more desperate, more dangerous. But Grandpa would be ready, because on his land, no one made the rules but him. Karen was not born a villain, though she certainly played the role with conviction by the time she had wormed her way into the title of HOA president. Before she earned her nickname as HOA Karen, she was simply Karen Whitmore, a woman who grew up in a neat suburban neighborhood where her parents never let her climb trees because it ruined the manicure she got every Sunday after church. Her father was the sort who measured success by the size of a lawn and the symmetry of hedges, and Karen inherited that obsession for appearances like some inherit a family heirloom. By the time she was an adult, she had already developed a sharp eye for what she called order and what everyone else would later call meddling. If a neighbor parked 2 inches over a painted line at the grocery store, she was the first to snap a photo and complain to the manager. When she and her husband moved into a gated community, she discovered the magic of HOA bylaws and covenants, and from that moment on it was like someone had handed her a sheriff's badge she had always been waiting to wear. She started small, volunteering for the landscaping committee, writing letters about flower choices and paint colors, but soon enough she was elected president because no one else wanted the thankless job. The power suited her, and she wore it proudly, patrolling the streets with a clipboard and a phone camera, acting like the fate of the nation depended on whether someone left their trash bin visible for too long. But her hunger grew the way hunger always does when it feeds on power. She hated limits, hated that her authority ended at the invisible borders of the HOA. And just beyond those borders was my grandfather's land, sprawling acres of untrimmed grass, wild chickens, and barns patched up with tin and old wood that didn't match the glossy perfection of her community. To Karen it was like a stain on her otherwise polished canvas. She hated that every time she drove by she saw smoke curling from his chimney and heard roosters crowing without her permission. She tried knocking on his door in the early days, telling him politely that the HOA could improve his property value if he joined, but Grandpa just laughed and told her property value didn't mean a thing when you already had everything you needed. She tried again a few weeks later with pamphlets, rules, and promises of neighborhood unity, but he closed the door before she finished her pitch. That rejection burned in her like a coal she never put out. The more Grandpa ignored her, the more obsessed she became. At board meetings she would bring up his land, asking if there was a way to annex it. She whispered to other members that his place was dragging down their property values, that his barn was unsafe, that his chickens carried disease. Most rolled their eyes and changed the subject, but Karen had a way of wearing people down until silence felt like agreement. Soon she was collecting signatures on petitions to expand HOA boundaries, even though legally it made no sense. The county clerks laughed her out of their office when she tried to file the paperwork, but she came back with a forced smile and more questions, convinced she just needed the right leverage. That was when she discovered her new tactic, fear. If she couldn't lure my grandfather in with promises of property value, she would force him in with the threat of consequences. She hired a shady lawyer who made more money chasing small-town drama than actual law, and together they cooked up letters stamped with official-looking seals that warned Grandpa of imaginary violations. He tossed them in the trash without reading them, but Karen saw every ignored letter as a personal insult. The humiliation drove her deeper into her obsession. She started dreaming up ways to look more official, to make her power feel real. When a cousin mentioned he knew some men who worked as security consultants for cash, Karen's eyes lit up. They weren't real police, not even close, but they had uniforms and badges bought online, and they looked the part if you didn't stare too long. To Karen, that was enough. The plan was born in a late-night meeting at her kitchen table with those so-called security men, their boots muddy from some other shady gig and their hands greedy for easy money. Karen laid out her scheme with the zeal of a general planning a war. She wanted them to act like law enforcement, to show up at Grandpa's land, intimidate him, and pressure him to sign HOA document. The men laughed at the idea but agreed when she waved cash in their faces. They didn't care who they scared as long as it wasn't someone who could fight back. Karen promised them Grandpa was old, harmless, a relic of a bygone era who would cave at the sight of uniforms. She didn't know him the way I did. She didn't know that behind his easy smile and slow drawl was a spine made of iron that had bent for no man and never would. Meanwhile Grandpa had his own reputation in town, one Karen never bothered to research. Folks respected him not just for his land but for the way he stood up for what was right. He had spent years working cattle, fixing barns, and helping neighbors when storms tore through. People trusted him because he was steady, because he didn't lie, and because he didn't bow to intimidation. Karen, wrapped up in her fantasy of control, saw none of this. In her mind, everything could be solved by staging a performance, by creating the illusion of authority strong enough to fool him. She practiced speeches in front of her bathroom mirror, rehearsed how she would present the papers, even coached her fake police on what lines to say. She imagined his shock, his surrender, the thrill of finally bending him under her rules. But even as she plotted, cracks began to form. Her neighbors grew weary of her endless crusade. They whispered that she was taking things too far, that it was one thing to find someone for weeds but another to impersonate law enforcement. Karen brushed them off, convinced they were simply afraid of bold leadership. She mistook their silence for loyalty, not realizing most were already laughing behind her back. She didn't see that she was alone, building a house of cards with nothing but her pride and paranoia holding it together. Still, the day she loaded those fake cops into her SUV, she felt triumphant, like a conqueror marching to victory. She dressed in her sharpest clothes, practiced her smile in the rearview mirror, and told herself this was the moment her power would extend beyond the gates of the HOA. She believed the county, the town, maybe even the whole valley would see her as the woman who tamed the last wild piece of land. The idea thrilled her so much she couldn't sit still, drumming her fingers on the steering wheel as she drove toward Grandpa's gate. She didn't notice the irony that while she dreamed of control, the men she hired were laughing quietly among themselves, joking about how easy this payday would be. What Karen failed to understand was that power borrowed is never power owned. Her fake police could put on the uniforms, carry the fake badges, and bark official-sounding commands, but the second they met a man who wasn't fooled, the entire illusion would shatter. She thought Grandpa's age made him weak, but age had made him sharper. She thought a badge made someone untouchable, but Grandpa knew better. And she thought fear would corner him, when in truth fear would corner her. The stage she built so carefully was about to collapse under its own weight, and when it did, she would be the one standing in the rubble. The morning after Karen's disastrous stunt with the fake police started like any other on my grandfather's land, with the sun rising over the fields, painting the sky in orange and pink, and the roosters crowing so loudly it sounded like they were in competition. Grandpa sat on his porch sipping coffee from the same chipped mug he had used for years, and I could tell by the calm way he whittled a piece of wood that he wasn't shaken at all by the confrontation the day before. If anything, he looked amused, as if the whole thing had been nothing more than a poorly staged play put on for his entertainment. But deep down I knew Karen wasn't finished. She wasn't the kind of woman who admitted defeat, not after she had convinced herself she was entitled to rule every square inch of land in sight. Sure enough, by mid-morning the crunch of tires announced trouble, and once again that black SUV came creeping down the gravel drive. This time, instead of strutting like victorious conquerors, the fake cops wore scowls and carried clipboards, clearly coached by Karen for another attempt. They got out, their boots raising little puffs of dust, and one of them, the taller one with a patchy mustache, cleared his throat and began reading off a list of supposed violations. He declared that Grandpa's barn was in violation of HOA Code 17B, that his grass was too tall, his chickens were unsanitary, and his old tractor was an eyesore. Each line he read sounded more ridiculous than the last, especially since Grandpa didn't even belong to the HOA. Karen herself stepped out of the SUV dressed in a bright red suit, her arms folded as if she were the Queen of England reviewing her subjects. She smirked each time the men barked a new violation, as though expecting Grandpa to crumble under the weight of their fabricated authority. But Grandpa simply leaned back in his rocking chair, sipped his coffee, and listened with the patience of a man who had seen far worse storms. When they finished their list and slapped a phony fine notice on the porch railing, Grandpa chuckled. It wasn't a mocking laugh, but a deep belly laugh that carried across the yard and made the chickens cluck in confusion. He stood up slowly, setting his mug aside, and said, "That's quite a list you got there. Only problem is, none of it applies to me." The fake cops exchanged glances, clearly unsettled by his calmness, and Karen stepped forward to regain control. She snapped that rules were rules, and that if he refused to comply, they would escalate the matter to legal action. Grandpa scratched his chin, then walked to the edge of the porch where his old hound dog was sleeping in the sun. He pointed at the dog and said, "Well, according to your logic, I should fine him too. He doesn't mow the grass, he leaves bones lying around, and he howls at the moon without permission. Guess that's a code violation, huh?" The fake cops shifted uncomfortably while Karen flushed red, but Grandpa wasn't done. He picked up the clipboard they had set down and flipped through it like he was grading a bad essay. "I notice you listed my barn as unsightly," he said, "but the County Historical Society calls it a landmark. Which one of you fine officers is gonna argue with them?" The men stammered, realizing they had no answer, and Karen hissed for them to stay on script. Grandpa handed the clipboard back, then leaned in with a grin that carried the sharpness of a blade. "Tell me something, boys. What county department do you work for? Because last I checked, the sheriff's office doesn't subcontract out to HOAs." His question hung in the air like a noose. The taller one swallowed hard and muttered something about special jurisdiction, which only made Grandpa laugh harder. "Special jurisdiction," he repeated, shaking his head. "Sounds more like you're selling tickets to a carnival than enforcing law." The neighbors who had gathered quietly along the fence line chuckled too, emboldened by Grandpa's wit. Karen tried to shout them down, saying this was official business, but the crowd only grew. Word had spread after yesterday's fiasco, and folks were eager to see what Grandpa would do next. Not one to disappoint, Grandpa decided to make a spectacle of their nonsense. He grabbed an old tin bucket from the porch and set it in front of the fake cop. "If you're gonna hand out fines, may as well make it fair," he said. "I fine you for littering my porch with that nonsense paper. $5, cash only." The crowd erupted in laughter, and the fake cops' faces burned crimson. Karen barked at them to stand their ground, but every time they tried to sound authoritative, Grandpa countered with humor and plain logic that cut their arguments to pieces. When they claimed his grass was a hazard, he reminded them that cows had been eating it just fine for decades. When they called his tractor an eyesore, he asked if they planned to mow the entire county to keep it pretty. By the time they accused his chickens of being a sanitary risk, Grandpa simply lifted a hen into his arms and said, "Well, she smells better than your paperwork." The tension that had started to weigh on me began to shift into amusement as I watched Karen's grand plan crumble. Her face twisted into a snarl, and she shouted that he was in violation of HOA code, to which Grandpa replied, "Darlin', the only code I follow is the one on the lock to my barn, and you don't have the numbers." The neighbors roared again, and Karen's composure cracked further. She tried to regain dignity by threatening to call higher authorities, but Grandpa was ready. He pointed toward the porch camera, its red light blinking steadily, and said, "Go ahead. Just remember, the whole county will see you trespassing on private property dressed like you're auditioning for a Halloween parade." That silenced her for a moment, because even she knew how bad it would look once the footage surfaced. The fake cops shuffled back toward the SUV, muttering that they'd be back with reinforcements. Grandpa tipped his hat, telling them to bring popcorn next time so the neighbors could enjoy the show properly. As they drove off, the crowd broke into applause, cheering Grandpa for standing tall against the farce. Some even offered to testify on his behalf if it came to a real legal fight, promising they had seen the whole charade. Grandpa waved them off with a smile, grateful but not surprised. He knew people respected honesty, and Karen's lies were starting to stink too strong to ignore. Of course, I knew Karen wouldn't stop. The way she had clenched her jaw and promised to return made it clear she was already scheming her next move. And while the fake cops might have been humiliated, they were greedy enough to come back for more pay if she waved the right amount of cash. But Grandpa wasn't worried. He leaned back, cradled his Colt across his lap, and stared out at the horizon. "Let her come," he muttered with a grin. "Every time she tries, she makes me look stronger and her look dumber. Sooner or later, even her own people will see it." His confidence was so absolute that even I, still jittery from the confrontation, felt a wave of calm settle over me. The war was far from over, but in that round at least, Grandpa had made fools out of every one of them. Karen's humiliation after the second failed attempt didn't cool her obsession, it only poured fuel on the fire. She spent the night pacing her immaculate kitchen, ranting to her reflection in the glass window, promising herself she would not be made a fool of again. She called every contact she had in the HOA, demanding backup, insisting they had to stand firm against what she called Grandpa's defiance. But most of them had seen the footage already, because Grandpa's camera had captured the entire fiasco and the neighbors who cheered him had shared it far and wide. By the time Karen tried to rally support, half the town was laughing about the fake cops and their phony fines. Parents joked about HOA officers patrolling Halloween candy, and kids mocked Karen by taping handwritten tickets to mailboxes. Each joke tightened the knot in her chest until she vowed the next move would silence the laughter once and for all. She called the fake police again, promising them more money if they would come back and finish the job, and she even printed new documents with thicker paper and shinier seals, convinced appearance was power. But Grandpa was 2 steps ahead of her. Grandpa had grown up in an era when you fixed your own problems and never relied on anyone else to clean up your mess. The morning after the confrontation, he walked the perimeter of his property, calm as always, but his eyes scanning every fence post and tree line with precision. He knew Karen wasn't done. He knew pride like hers could not handle defeat. So he prepared the way a man who had lived through storms prepares, quietly, methodically, without fuss. He replaced the batteries in his porch camera, checked the angles, and even set up new ones hidden along the driveway and barn, disguised in birdhouses and nailed into fence posts. He wasn't paranoid, just practical. He told me people like Karen eventually hang themselves with their own rope, but it helps if you give them the rope in the first place. That was his strategy now, to let her schemes play out under the cold, unblinking eye of his cameras until the truth was undeniable. By noon that day Karen struck again. The SUV roared up louder this time, like they wanted everyone to hear it. Out stepped the same fake cops, this time joined by two new faces wearing uniforms that didn't even match the first pair. They carried clipboards, folders, and even what looked like a badge wallet, though from where I stood it looked cheap and flimsy. Karen strutted ahead, announcing to anyone within earshot that this was an official compliance raid. She wanted the neighbors to hear, wanted to drown out the laughter with the sound of her authority. Unfortunately for her, half the neighborhood had gathered again at the fence line, ready for another show, and Grandpa was already sitting on his porch with his coffee, his Colt resting casually across his lap like always. The fake cops marched toward the barn, pointing out imaginary hazards and scribbling on their clipboards. One declared the roof was unstable and condemned, even though it had been patched solid just last spring. Another claimed the chicken coop was a biohazard, waving his arms dramatically as hens clucked and strutted around his boot. Karen nodded furiously at each claim, ordering them to write larger fines, to document everything. She thought she was winning, that her louder voice and bigger crowd meant she was back in control. But Grandpa simply reached over and tapped a remote on the porch table. The old television set inside flickered on, and the live feed from his hidden cameras played right there in the living room for anyone watching through the window. Every false claim, every exaggerated gesture, every smug grin was captured in crystal clarity. The neighbors started chuckling again, some pulling out their phones to record Karen recording herself. When one of the fake cops tried to hammer a notice into a fence post, Grandpa stood up and walked over with deliberate steps, slow but steady. He looked at the paper, looked at the man, and said, "You know that's private property, right? Which one of you is ready to explain to the sheriff why you're vandalizing it?" The man stammered, insisting he had jurisdiction, but Grandpa only smiled and pointed at the blinking camera hidden above them in a birdhouse. The man's face drained of color as he realized every word was being filmed. Karen tried to save face by shouting that the HOA had its own enforcement division, but Grandpa cut her off with a calm voice that carried farther than her shrill cries. "You don't have enforcement. You don't have jurisdiction. What you have is a whole lot of nerve and a camera pointing at your lies." The crowd at the fence burst into applause, and even some HOA members shook their heads in embarrassment. Karen, furious and flustered, screamed that this was harassment, that Grandpa was the one breaking laws. But then came the twist none of us expected. Just as she was yelling, a county sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly down the road and stopped at the gate. The real deal, lights off, calm as Sunday morning. The deputy stepped out, adjusting his hat, and walked toward the group with the confidence of someone who didn't need to raise his voice. Karen froze, her mouth snapping shut for the first time in weeks. The fake cops tried to look official, standing taller, but the deputy didn't even glance at them at first. He walked straight up to Grandpa, shook his hand, and asked if there was a problem. Grandpa pointed calmly at the clipboard-waving men and said, "These fine folks claim to be law enforcement. Care to check their badges?" The deputy's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened as he turned toward the imposters. He asked for identification, for precinct numbers, for supervisor contact information. Each man fumbled, stuttered, and finally admitted they had nothing official to show. The deputy's hand hovered near his holster, and the crowd grew silent. Karen tried desperately to spin the story, claiming they were a contracted HOA security team, but the deputy silenced her with a raised hand. He looked directly at her and said, "Ma'am, impersonating an officer is a serious crime. I suggest you stop talking before you add obstruction to the list." The air was electric, and for once Karen had no retort. The fake cops shuffled nervously, sweat dripping down their brows as the deputy called for backup on his radio. Within minutes another cruiser pulled in, and the imposters were being questioned, their fake badges confiscated. The neighbors recorded everything, cheering as the men's bravado melted away. Karen stood rigid, pale as chalk, her grand plan collapsing in front of everyone she wanted to impress. Grandpa didn't gloat, didn't need to. He simply tipped his hat to the deputy and sat back down on his porch, the Colt resting in plain sight, a symbol not of violence but of his unshakable resolve. That night, as the stars came out and the crickets sang, Grandpa leaned back on his porch and smiled. He didn't revel in victory, didn't rant about his rights. He just said, "Funny thing about lies, boy, they look strong until you shine a light on 'em. Then they crumble like wet paper." He sipped his coffee, the Colt resting near his chair, and for the first time in days I felt the tension ease from my chest. Karen would scheme again, no doubt, but her power was waning. She had tried fear, deception, and force, but each move only exposed her more. Grandpa had turned her ambition into her undoing, and he hadn't raised his voice or fired a shot. The days following the sheriff's visit should have ended the feud, but Karen's pride was a stubborn beast that refused to die quietly. Her reputation in the neighborhood was in shambles. The fake cops she had paraded around were under investigation, and the townsfolk could hardly pass her without smirking. But rather than admit defeat, she doubled down on her crusade. She called emergency HOA meetings where she ranted for hours about Grandpa being a danger to the community, trying to convince anyone who would listen that he was the villain in the story. Most people sat in silence, some out of politeness, others because they didn't want to provoke her fury, but whispers afterward revealed the truth. Karen had become the laughingstock of the town. Still, her obsession with bringing Grandpa under her thumb pushed her to a final desperate gamble. She decided to call in lawyers, not shady back-alley attorneys this time but polished suits from the city, men who knew how to wield paperwork like sword. She paid them with HOA funds, presenting them as champions of justice, and they arrived with briefcases full of documents meant to bury Grandpa in legal threat. The showdown began one hot afternoon when a convoy of sedans pulled up to Grandpa's gate, their polished tires crunching the gravel like the march of an invading army. Karen emerged flanked by two lawyers, each carrying stacks of papers thick enough to choke a mule. They walked with smug confidence, their ties stiff and their voices loud, projecting superiority as they announced Grandpa was being served. According to them, his land was subject to annexation under revised HOA boundaries, his buildings were non-compliant with zoning codes, and his refusal to join the association was grounds for civil penalties. They tried to bury him under paragraphs of legal jargon, waving their papers like shields. Karen beamed, certain she finally had him cornered. The neighbors gathered again along the fence, drawn by the spectacle, whispering among themselves as the polished lawyers tried to intimidate the old man on his porch. Grandpa didn't budge. He leaned back in his rocking chair, listening carefully, his Colt resting lazily on the table beside him as always, though untouched. He let them finish their performance before standing, brushing dust off his jeans, and walking inside. Karen smirked at the crowd, whispering that he was probably panicking, finally realizing the weight of the law was against him. But when Grandpa returned, he carried a leather folder older than most of the people present. He placed it gently on the porch table, opened it, and pulled out a stack of documents that looked weathered yet carefully preserved. He began reading, not with the bluster of the lawyers but with the calm authority of a man who knew the truth was on his side. He revealed land deeds dating back over a century, signed and notarized by county officials long before the HOA even existed. He pointed to maps that outlined his property line in clear ink, maps filed with the county clerk and stamped with seals far more legitimate than the ones Karen's lawyers had waved around. The lawyers faltered, shifting uncomfortably as Grandpa flipped page after page, explaining how his land had been grandfathered, no pun lost on the crowd, into exemptions that protected it from zoning changes and municipal absorption. He spoke plainly, but every word carried weight. "This land," he said, tapping the paper, "was deeded to my family before your HOA even had its first bake sale. You got no jurisdiction here. Not now, not ever." Karen's smile cracked as murmurs rippled through the onlookers. The lawyers tried to recover, stammering about legal loopholes, but Grandpa was ready. He pulled out recent correspondence from the county itself, letters confirming his independence and immunity from HOA enforcement. He even had a signed statement from the county commissioner affirming his rights. He placed it on the pile like the final card in a winning hand, and the lawyers' faces drained of color. Karen exploded, shouting that it was all fabricated, that Grandpa was lying, but her voice trembled as she said it. The sheriff, who had quietly arrived after hearing rumblings of the spectacle, stepped forward again. He picked up the documents, examined the seals, and nodded with approval. "These are real," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "And they're ironclad. This property is private, outside HOA jurisdiction. You've wasted enough of this man's time." The crowd cheered, some clapping, others laughing outright at Karen's unraveling composure. She tried to argue, demanding the sheriff reconsider, but the deputy cut her off. "If you push this any further, ma'am, you'll be the one facing charges: misuse of funds, harassment, and interference with private property rights." The words struck like a hammer, and for the first time Karen looked genuinely afraid. Grandpa didn't press his advantage cruelly. He simply gathered his papers, slid them back into the leather folder, and said, "Some folks think power comes from shouting the loudest. Truth is, power comes from knowing where you stand and having the proof to back it up. I stand right here, and I've got all the proof I need." His calm voice carried across the yard, silencing every lingering doubt. The lawyers muttered apologies, retreating toward their cars, their polished shoes crunching the gravel with far less confidence than when they arrived. Karen, trembling with rage, climbed back into her SUV, slamming the door so hard the sound echoed through the valley. She peeled away in a cloud of dust, leaving behind nothing but the remnants of her pride. The neighbors surged forward, congratulating Grandpa, patting his back, laughing at Karen's failed spectacle. Some offered to bring pie and coffee to celebrate, while others said they'd happily testify on his behalf if she tried again. Grandpa smiled, but he reminded everyone that victory wasn't about humiliating someone else. It was about standing for what was right. Still, I could see the twinkle in his eye when he said it, because he knew Karen had been beaten on every front. Her fake cops had crumbled, her bogus fines had been mocked, and now her polished city lawyers had been turned into stuttering fools by the strength of his documents. It wasn't just a victory, it was a lesson. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in gold, Grandpa sat with me on the porch, sipping from his chipped mug, the Colt glinting faintly beside him. "Boy," he said, his voice calm but firm, "don't ever let anyone convince you that bluster beats truth. Papers can be faked, uniforms can be bought, but the real thing stands the test of time. And when you know you're in the right, you don't need to shout or fight. You just need to stand firm and let the lies fall apart." His words etched themselves into me, not just as advice but as a creed. But even as we sat there, I knew the story wasn't over. Karen was humiliated, yes, but she was also dangerous in her desperation. A cornered opponent doesn't always retreat, sometimes they lash out harder. I could see in Grandpa's steady eyes that he knew it too. He wasn't celebrating recklessly because he understood the war wasn't finished. She had one last card to play, one last desperate act before the end. And though the showdown seemed complete, the final chapter was yet to be written, the one that would decide whether Karen's reign of chaos ended with shame or something far darker. The sun had barely risen the morning after the lawyers fled, when word spread through town that Karen had been seen storming into the county courthouse demanding an emergency injunction against my grandfather. Some people laughed, others shook their heads, but all agreed it was the last gasp of a woman who had dug herself into a hole too deep to climb out of. Her obsession had become a spectacle, and though most of her neighbors had grown weary of her antics, there was still that dangerous edge to her desperation. A person who cannot accept defeat is capable of almost anything, and that truth revealed itself later that very afternoon when another unmarked SUV rolled up to Grandpa's property, this time not just with the familiar fake cops but with a van following behind filled with even more shady-looking men. They carried toolboxes, measuring sticks, and clipboards as though preparing for an official demolition. Karen marched in front of them, her face twisted with determination, announcing loudly that the HOA had authorized them to seize and dismantle non-compliant structures. She shouted it loud enough for the whole valley to hear, hoping the performance alone would make it real. Grandpa stood on the porch, his rocking chair creaking as he rose, calm as ever, though his eyes narrowed just slightly when he saw the crowd. He didn't reach for his Colt this time. He didn't need to. The cameras were already rolling, the neighbors had already gathered, and most importantly, the county sheriff had been tipped off. Within minutes the rumble of official cruisers echoed up the road, blue lights flashing against the trees. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Karen, caught mid-rant, froze as the sheriff himself stepped out, flanked by deputies. They moved with quiet authority, the kind that doesn't need shouting, and walked straight past Karen as though she wasn't even there. They approached the fake cops first, asking for identification, licenses, and permit. Just like before, their words stumbled, their papers vanished, and within moments handcuffs clicked around their wrist. One tried to protest, claiming they were contracted security, but the sheriff shut him down with a cold glare and the words, "You don't impersonate my badge, and walk away free." The rest went silent, their swagger gone, replaced by fear. Karen shrieked that this was all a mistake, that she had the authority to hire them, that the HOA bylaws gave her the right. But the sheriff turned on her, his patience spent. He told her she had crossed the line from overreach into criminal conduct. Misuse of HOA funds, harassment, attempted fraud, and conspiracy were just a few of the charges he listed. The crowd gasped as Karen's face drained of color, her carefully constructed world unraveling in front of everyone she once lorded over. She tried to shout back, but every word sounded weaker than the last, her voice cracking as deputies surrounded her. When they finally placed her under arrest, reading her rights in a calm monotone, the neighbors erupted into cheers that rolled across the valley like thunder. Some clapped, others laughed, and a few shook their heads in disbelief that it had gone this far. Karen was escorted into the back of a cruiser, her red suit wrinkled, her hair falling from its perfect bun, her sunglasses gone. She looked less like the queen she pretended to be and more like a child caught sneaking cookies from the jar. Grandpa didn't cheer. He didn't gloat. He simply tipped his hat to the sheriff and thanked him for doing his job. He stood there in the quiet that followed, letting the moment settle into the earth like rain after a drought. When the cruisers pulled away, taking Karen and her cronies with them, the neighbors lingered, some patting Grandpa on the back, others shaking his hand, all grateful that the ordeal was finally over. They spoke about how Karen had been a thorn in their side for years, how her obsession with power had poisoned the community, and how it took Grandpa's unshakable resolve to finally bring her down. That evening we sat together on the porch again, the same place where it had all begun. The sky was painted with streaks of purple and gold as the sun dipped low, and the crickets started their nightly song. Grandpa sipped his coffee slowly, the Colt resting near his chair, polished and silent, a symbol of strength never abused. He turned to me and spoke in that calm, measured voice that carried wisdom heavier than any law book. He said that people like Karen exist everywhere, people who mistake control for leadership and fear for respect. They build their power on intimidation and appearances, but it only lasts as long as others believe the illusion. The moment truth shines through, the illusion collapses. He gestured toward his cameras, toward the deeds locked in his folder, and toward the wide open fields stretching beyond. All I ever needed to win was the truth, boy. The truth and the patience to let their lies fall apart on their own. I asked him if he had ever been scared, even for a moment, when Karen's fake police first showed up. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. Scared? No. Cautious, sure. But I've lived long enough to know you don't meet a lie with fear. You meet it with calm. And sometimes you put a little steel on your lap to remind folks you won't be bullied. He patted the Colt, not as a weapon but as an old companion. It ain't about firing it. It's about showing them you're not the one who's going to blink first. In the weeks that followed, the HOA scrambled to recover. Karen was removed from her position, her trial loomed, and her name became a punchline in every diner and bar across the county. The new leadership vowed to restore trust, to focus on community instead of control, and to distance themselves from the madness Karen had caused. As for Grandpa, nothing changed. He still fed his chickens, mowed his fields, patched his barn, and rocked on his porch each evening with the same steady rhythm. Life returned to normal on his land, but for those who had witnessed the battle, nothing would ever be quite the same. People had seen what it meant to stand firm, to resist lies without losing dignity, and they carried that lesson with them. One night, sitting under the stars, I asked Grandpa what he thought Karen's downfall really meant. He leaned back, eyes on the sky, and said, "It means you can't buy authority, and you can't fake respect. You earn it by living right and standing tall when it counts." That woman thought she could bend the world to her will, but the world has a way of humbling folks who think they're bigger than it. His words hung in the air like the constellations above, steady and timeless. Grandpa raised his mug to me with a small grin and said, "Never underestimate an old cowboy, boy. Folks like Karen forget we didn't get this far by giving in easy." And with that, he leaned back, eyes on the horizon, rocking steady, a monument to resilience. The war was over, but the lesson would outlive every fence, every deed, every law: stand firm, live honest, and never let a bully write your story.